In this video lesson, we will discuss the long-term economic growth. Economic growth is simply an increase in real GDP over time. Please pay attention to the word real. We are talking about a real increase in real output, not just nominal GDP, but increase in real output. There was a separate video on the differences between real and nominal. Please pay attention to this. Economic growth is simply an increase in real GDP over time. What is important is that the quicker the economy is growing, the quicker our standards of living will go up. And that is why every government tries to stimulate economic growth. This is one of the main macroeconomic policy objectives. If economy is growing at a rate of 10% per year, it will double its GDP and therefore standards of living roughly in about 7 years. Our country for the last 50 years has grown at a much lower rate of approximately 2.5%, which implies that our GDP can double in 28 years, which is significantly lower. And most of the developed countries demonstrate these relatively low growth rates, 2-3% at best. Japan, for example, isn't growing at all practically, while developing countries are usually growing at much quicker rate. For example, China has demonstrated a rate of economic growth above 10% for the last nearly 2 decades. In the recent years, the rate of growth in China has slowed down. It's about 6-7% now, but it is still considerably higher compared to UK, America, and other European countries. Let's talk about the sources of economic growth. What exactly can encourage economic growth in a country? The thing is, economic growth implies not just increase in current production level, it implies increase in the potential output. In other words, for the economic growth to be sustained over the long term, we need to accelerate and increase the potential production level, our capacity to produce output. In other words, we need to shift our production possibility frontier to the right. Let's recall what PPF curve means. PPF curve, or production possibility frontier curve, shows the maximum level of output which our economy can produce, can generate. This is what we've covered at one of the very first lectures. And it is plotted like this. We have good 1 produced along horizontal axis, and the second good, some good 2, along vertical axis. And production possibility frontier, PPF curve, shows the maximum combinations of good 1 and good 2 which our economy is capable of producing. Any points beyond this curve are not achievable because we don't have enough resources. Any point within this curve, for example, point A, implies that we are not utilizing all our resources adequately. We can expand production of both goods by moving towards PPF curve. And this movement from point A to some points B or C on PPF curve is not economic growth. So movement from points A to B or to C is not economic growth. It simply implies an increase in current production level. For the true growth to take place, we need to shift the whole PPF curve outwards. And this movement from the original PPF to the new higher PPF curve is indeed economic growth. This is how we represent it. We are expanding production of both goods without making any sacrifices. We increase our capacity to produce, and this can be achieved using 2 methods. We can achieve economic growth by increasing the amount of resources available to us, by increasing the quantity of inputs used in the production process, or by increasing their productivity, in other words, quality of our inputs, our factors of production. As we know, there are 4 main factors of production: capital, labor, land, and entrepreneurship. And in order to promote economic growth, we can increase the amount of these inputs, factors of production, in our disposal. For example, we can increase the amount of capital in our economy by stimulating investment, by higher rate of new investment and higher potential growth rate of this investment. We can encourage new investment into our economy by attracting investors from abroad, by building new capital equipment, and so on. We can increase the amount of labor in our country by using various demographic policies to encourage the growth of population through immigration, encouraging higher birth rates, and so on. Apart from this, we can increase the amount of available labor stock in a country by increasing participation rates, because many, or many citizens which live in the country do not contribute to labor force. They have chosen not to work. For example, women who decide to look after their families and they don't work, they rely on husband's income. And if we encourage their participation in labor force by encouraging them to work part-time, etc., this will increase available labor stock in the country. Apart from this, we can develop skills of existing labor stock, but we can develop their human capital. We can try to teach, to educate our citizens to make them more productive. By increasing their skills, we are able to produce more with available labor stock because every person becomes more productive. We can try to increase the amount of land at our disposal. And here, land includes all natural resources. So, for example, we can explore new sources of new raw materials, oil, gas, copper, etc. Previously, in previous centuries, you can increase the amount of land at your disposal by initiating a war and capturing some of your neighbors' territories. Obviously, nowadays, this cannot happen. However, we can still increase the amount of natural resources at our disposal by exploring the land which is available to us. Apart from this, a very important factor in economic growth is the growth of entrepreneurship, which is another factor of production. By encouraging private enterprise, by stimulating people to start up new businesses, by supporting them, by running business incubators, accelerators, and other programs, by educating people on how to start up, we are able to increase the amount of entrepreneurial activity in the country, and by doing so, we can achieve higher growth of national GDP. Apart from this, so all these four factors will imply that we are increasing the number, the amount of factors of production, the quantity of these factors. However, we can also increase and improve the quality of our factors. By encouraging technological progress, we can try to make all these available factors more productive. By encouraging technological progress and innovation in the economy, we increase efficiency, productivity of all available inputs, which also allows us to shift production possibility frontier curve to the right. So there are two main types of promoting economic growth: is increasing amount, quantity of factors of production, and increasing their quality and productivity. And technological progress is the main factor which determines the rate of economic growth in a country. Government can try to encourage the rate of economic growth, can increase the rate of growth in two ways: by focusing on the demand side, by shifting aggregate demand, for example, by increasing government expenditure, or by focusing on the supply side, in other words, trying to shift aggregate supply curve in order to increase potential output. For example, this can include measures to encourage research and development in the economy, innovation, private enterprise, investment in infrastructure, training, and so on. All these factors will shift aggregate supply curve to the right. Let me show you this on a graph. Let's have a look. This is what the government can try to pursue. This is our main graph, so price level along vertical axis, national output or GDP along horizontal axis, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, and slightly more complex aggregate supply curve with horizontal upward sloping and vertical part. Demand side policy implies that we are shifting aggregate demand curve to the right. So this would include demand side policies. Demand side policies. So anything which will shift aggregate demand curve to the right. And as we have covered in the previous lecture, this will include monetary policy, fiscal policy, for example, reduction in interest rates, increasing government expenditure, reducing taxes, etc. All of these factors will shift aggregate demand curve from point 1 to point 2, which will lead to higher output. So national output will increase. However, demand side policies will lead to short-run effects, short-run increase in national GDP. What represents the true growth policy is the shift in aggregate supply curve. By shifting aggregate supply curve, we are able to move from point 1 to point 2 as before. However, when we shift aggregate supply, we are actually increasing our production potential. We are not only increasing our current level of output, we are also expanding our capacity to produce it in the future. So supply side policy will include any factor which will shift aggregate supply curve to the right. And as I mentioned previously, this involves measures to encourage research and development, innovation, private enterprise, infrastructural developments, training, developing human capital, and so on. And what is interesting is that by doing so, we are not only increasing national output, as with the demand side policy, we are also reducing price level in the country. Have a look. As we move from point 1 to point 2, by pursuing expansionary demand side policy, we will stimulate inflation. Price level will go up. In other words, we will suffer from inflation, which will be the downside of the demand side policy. Yes, we will achieve a higher rate of growth, but this growth will represent a growth on current output rather than potential output, while supply side policy will allow you to increase current output, will increase production potential of the economy. We'll come back to this slightly later in the course again. And moreover, it will also reduce inflation, reduce price level in the economy, which means that supply side policy is more productive, more effective, and more beneficial for the country. However, you will ask, why don't we always pursue supply side policy? This is because these measures will take time. It's much easier for the government to increase government expenditure, for example. They can easily implement new expansionary measures in their new budget as early as next year. This will have more or less quick effect, while developing infrastructure or encouraging research and development will take much longer, and the result is not guaranteed. And that is why basically the government might pursue this, but it's just simply easier for them to focus on the demand side. Also, the country will pay for these policies with high inflation. In any case, regardless of what the government decides to choose, what policy it will select to stimulate growth, investment will play a key role, because investment will stimulate both demand. It will shift aggregate demand curve, because investment is one of the components of aggregate demand, and it will also shift aggregate supply curve, especially if we talk about investment in infrastructure, developing human capital, training, etc. And as a result, investment is crucial in order to stimulate economic growth.